All right, guys, here we go. So let us jump straight into choosing assessments. And this whole module is all about assessing candidate quality and rank ordering candidates as described in the overview. So choosing assessments was the big picture. Yeah, remember we began with job analysis and that yielded the person specifications. We converted JA to the person specifications. Ultimately, though, we need to rank order candidates. We need some systematic and fair way, really emphasis on both of those words, systematic and fair, to assess candidates on those person specifications. So this is a very step-by-step linear model, very straightforward. Now, what are the goals of assessment? Well, we want to maximize fit to the position. That goes all the way back to the beginning of the course. Hey, Annika, did you come to say hello to everybody? Okay, well, good for you. We need an accurate assessment. We need to maximize return on investment. That is, we are spending the company's money, and we need to really demonstrate that we are saving the company money and making the company money as a result of our very empirically driven employee selection process. So we've got to generate positive stakeholder reactions, and all the people who are touched by this process could be considered stakeholders. We want to put our best foot forward in front of all of these people. We want to support the talent philosophy of the HR strategy, and we've discussed that to a great extent. We want to establish and reinforce employer image. So when people walk away from our assessment processes, we want ultimately for them to say, these people have their shit together and they got their heart in the right place. Those two qualities, right? We want to identify new hires' developmental needs. If that's part of the equation, that might be something we're doing along the way. That we might be looking at potential and understanding how potential can be realized through training. We need to assess ethically, and I don't know how many times we have to say that, right? And we need to ensure legal compliance. So we're going to look at always being able to document and demonstrate why we've done what we've done, ultimately always getting back to this supports bona fide occupational qualifications. So, the dimensions of fit, when we say we got to maximize fit, well, there's a lot of different ways to look at fit, and we have to kind of determine what's most important. Person-job fit, is probably the ultimate. Does this person actually fit the position requirements, right? And what are possible dimensions? Maybe intelligence, but that one is really being demonstrated to be non-predictive over the long haul, but was thought to be important years ago. Job-related skills and competencies, you can see, well, there's requires little justification. Job knowledge certainly requires little justification. Previous experience could be important. And personally related to performing job tasks. That's personality components that might support or kind of inhibit performance on the job. So these are all characteristics of person-job fit. Maybe we consider the most important. Now, the person-group fit is the match between individuals and their work groups, including their supervisors. This is important, but probably comes in second to the person-to-job fit. But what does the person-to-group fit include? What is a person's teamwork skills? If they're going to be expected to work in teams extensively, maybe that's something we want to test if we believe it's a priority. And notice, we've set up a system for developing and prioritizing all of these aspects of fit in person specifications as resulting from job analysis. Expertise relative to other team members. So are we bringing something to the party with this new hire, right, that will enhance the team's performance? Conflict management style. And that could go from, I got none, to I'm very skilled interacting with others. Preference for team-based work, and this might be something that we want to assess. If a lot of work's going to be done in teams, then we probably better assess this kind of preference for that type of work. I've discovered the older I get, the less I seem to be like a team player. The courses that I struggle with to the greatest extent our team level courses, especially 236701, which has a tremendous, well, we have a lot of instructors teaching that, and we have a supervisor, and there's far less autonomy. Now, I might be going against the grain saying that, but there's far less autonomy in teaching that course than any other course I teach, and that can be a struggle for me at times. Is that something that could be picked up on during the assessment process, and something that could be ranked in that people who are going to have to work in teams should prefer to do so? Communication skills, and certainly that could be an aspect of the group fit, and personality related to working well with others. Or not, as we might detect. The person-organization fit often looks at motivations and values, right, and goals to see if there's consistency between the organization and the person. And then the person-to-vocation fit. Is this actually a good work area? Is this a good vocation for the person? And this might then, we might look at aptitudes, we might look at interests, personal values, long-term goals to determine this. I think the focus is highest at the top of this list and then diminishes perhaps as we move down the list. Now, what is typically used, and this is going to be hard to maybe read in your current viewing, but you have it in the lecture notes. This is just a comparison of some commonly used external assessment methods. And so, for example, assessment centers, right? We see the average validity of 37.37, and we're going to talk about how that's computed later in the course. What's the applicant's reaction? Well, the applicants seem to have a good reaction to this. The relative cost is it can be very high, right? And this is developing it and administering it. Notice that there's two evaluations there. Adverse impact, likely to be low, especially if it's well developed, and the usability, difficult to use, right? And assessment centers require a lot of organization. When I went to work for Boise Cascade, they ran us through an assessment center, 2-day assessment center. It's difficult to organize, it's time consuming, and it was very expensive. One could question that was it the best method for what they were trying to do? So, cognitive ability tests, well, okay, average validity, they can be valid, the reaction's good, the cost is relatively low for both administration and development, right? Adverse impact can be quite high though, and this is problematic. And many people are looking at this because a lot of times cognitive ability in these tests is assessed in such a way that favors white middle class folk, pure and simple, because they went to the schools that kind of feed to these types of tests, right? Now let's go job knowledge test. Well, here we go. 4.8, average validity, pretty high validity, right? Good applicant reaction because it makes sense. It can be high to develop, but it could be, it could be, where am I? I've lost my place. Job knowledge tests, right? Could be high to develop, low to administer. The usability is easy. So you go on down the list. You can look at all of these. Graphology doesn't work out too well. What is graphology? Yeah, handwriting analysis. Let's not go there. Handwriting analysis is like one step below astrology. So asking people what their sign is and giving them the job because they're a Taurus. Because we know Taurus will be persistent, right? Or not. So, and so it goes. You can see interviews are not faring too well, right? Unstructured interviews, not too well. Personality testing is abysmal. And so it goes. And part of what I'm going to ask you to do in future assignments is be able to actually look up validity numbers of pre-existing tests and make sense of that. Now, test job performance, and ultimately, isn't this what we're trying to do, is predict performance? And again, this is where record keeping comes in place. That is, when I hire people, I have their assessment scores. And now, as they move through their career, those assessment scores were intended to predict on-the-job performance, or I shouldn't be using them in the first place. But then, if I develop appropriate performance measures, I can then longitudinally correlate the assessment scores. Did they predict the actual on-the-job performance? And then I can make a stronger and stronger case for using those assessment items or dumping those assessment items in future iterations of our assessment process. Now, I love the website 80,000 Hours, and you might want to check this out. This is really about helping match people to occupational opportunities. And I strongly urge, if you Google 80,000 Hours, you can be taken to this website, and it's going to give you more information about finding work. And basically, part of the website's ultimate design is, what do you think 80,000 hours means? Well, they use that title for their website because that's the average of us can look forward to working for 80,000 hours of our life. I know, you probably didn't want to hear that. But the website is especially geared to college students who are approaching, especially the end of their college career. And it's like, what the hell am I going to do? I mean, I might have a 4-year degree under my belt, but I'm no closer to understanding what it is I want to do or should be doing than I was when I entered into this college or university. 80,000 Hours has a lot of good advice and a lot of introspective tools to help you kind of understand yourself. I think between ONA and 80,000 Hours, really good career counseling opportunity combining those two. I've had at least one assignment now in psychology of adjustment in the work module that references 80,000 hours as part of the project of that assignment. So what do they find? Work sample tests, man. Good correlation with job performance. IQ tests, good correlation with job performance. But remember, the downside to IQ tests is tremendous level of adverse impact. So interviews, structured interviews can be quite good, right? Peer ratings, job knowledge tests, pretty darn good. When we get down to unstructured interviews, we see starting to not be so good. Job experience, not necessarily predictive. Years of education predicts like virtually nothing. Holland type match. How many of you have done the Holland? Yeah, it does predict shit, right? It predicts as well as graphology, and age predicts nothing as well. So if you want to check out the website, plenty more. Now, when we do the assessment, ultimately what we're saying is this assessment will lead to hiring the best candidate for the position. And let's suppose, though, that the possible assessment outcomes fall into one of 4 categories. Well, one of those categories would be, what happens if we determine that we should hire this person but they perform poorly? We call that a false positive. That is, we are positive, we got, the indication, yes, hire this person, but in fact it was an error, so it's a false positive. That's known in the vernacular as a type 1 error. Now, if someone we hire performs well, then that's a true positive. Good on us, good for our system. Now, if we don't hire them and they perform poorly or would have performed poorly, then that's a true negative. And note that that's kind of the unknown and the unknowable, right? Because we don't have their performance measures because we didn't hire them. And then the false negative is the type 2 error. This means that they would have performed well, but we didn't hire them. And again, this is something that we can't necessarily get at, right? So, which of these generates measurable outcomes? Which can be best conceived of as the unknown or the unknowable? So you can think about that for a moment or two and answer those questions. Now, return on investment can be computed. How many of you are happy that we're not going to do that in this class? So, the economic value of improved performance, and you can see that string of variables there, and the savings from avoiding bad hires, you can see there. The return on investment is the economic value of improved performance plus savings from avoiding bad hires. Okay, so we make money hiring well, and we also save money from not hiring poorly. Ultimately, that dictates indicates or is the evaluation of the return of investment on the hiring process, the assessments that we're using. Okay, so we're not going to go here, right? Just to give you an example, and I know that some of you don't have the textbooks, I wanted to include some of these things for you just so you have kind of a leg up on understanding it. Let's talk about it more in plain English. The return on investment, the savings from avoiding bad hires, reflects the fact that bad hires can actually cost an organization money. If you have a bad hire and you have to let that person go, that means you have to hire someone to replace them. So now, at the very least, you're spending money to hire 2 people when you should have only spent money to hire 1, the correct one. Now, if the bad hire causes some serious problems in your organization that could lead to excessive costs, then we can see where the costs really start to expand in a bad hire. The return on investment from a new assessment method is the sum of the economic value of improved performance and savings from avoiding bad hires. Right. So, if we're going to hire, let's say, lecturers for the psychology department, note that the way the university has now developed the various schools, they're in competition with each other. So arts and science is competing for your tuition dollars with other departments, right? So to the extent that we can hire good instructors that people enjoy taking their classes and word of mouth, then see, we can actually steal some, for example, elective money from other departments, from other areas, because we put our best foot forward because we had good hires. Difficult to compute, but can be computed to a certain extent. Staffing shouldn't be seen as an investment rather than a cost, I'm sorry, let me restate that. Staffing should be seen as an investment rather than a cost, but we still have to consider the cost is important to many companies, right? Depending on how those companies are structured especially. And for example, when you take the individual schools and departments within Ohio State now and you make them individual cost centers and you track their financial performance individually, it puts the pressure on to hire better, hire more profitably, so to speak. So the formula provides a way to estimate the return on investment of the new assessment method. And usually formulas like that are embedded in some form of software that you'd be using on the job. So generally you're just plugging in numbers and letting the computer crank away on the answers rather than having to do the calculations yourself. The downside is that if there's an error in the calculations and we don't understand how it works, then we might not detect the error. That was the unfortunate legacy of taking factor analysis with Dr. Brown, is he taught us to do so many things by hand so that we would understand it conceptually. And when we got to the end of the course, the last 2 weeks we were using the using the computer program to do factor analysis, and it's like, oh my God, we've spent 8 weeks so far, because it was a quarter class, we spent 8 weeks so far torturing ourselves with this shit, when all we have to do is plug these numbers into the computer and it spits out the answer, but he wasn't going to go there for us. So understanding how it works can be important. Now, we have to be in legal compliance. Remember, that was one of the points from the beginning slide of the lecture. KSA is define and measure in terms of behavior and performance. So we're always going to push to engage in more performance-oriented behavioral measures, right? Rather than global characteristics. We'll get more into that later. Must be demonstrably related to job performance, and here's where the record keeping comes in. We're going to keep those assessment scores. We're going to measure people's performance down the road. We're going to assess the correlation, and we're going to say, look at the high level of predictive validity of our measures to on-the-job performance. And if we don't observe that high predictive validity, then we're going to think about changing those assessments, modifying those assessments so they become more predictive in the future. But note that we're in this for the long haul. We're not just, this is not a one-up, hey, let's measure things and hope for the best. We're going to measure our assessment, and then we're going to correlate that with the on-the-job performance. Measures should, as closely possible, match the job behaviors. This then really ensures what we might call construct validity, That is, are we measuring what we say we're measuring, and are we measuring what we should be measuring, right? And this is the elements of bona fide occupational qualifications developed through the job analysis and subsequent development of person specifications. So, what's a typical sequence of assessment? And this is something you would have to plan as a human resources professional. If you were running the assessment, you need to prioritize and you need to order your operations. So initially it might be screening, and this might be done at the level of looking at the employment applications, rejecting some on the basis of some predefined criteria and pushing others through on the basis of that same criteria. Interviewing, testing, examinations, certifications, and attainment all come next. Once we have all that data as a result of those procedures, we sit down and we score, weight, and norm those scores. And based on that, then we're able to rank our applicants in order of our preference based on the superiority of their performance. So what might screening look like? That was the first element. Well, we might do background checks, and that's probably one that's really simple to do, really straightforward, and should be done up front. And notice that background checks generally are done to remove candidates from the pool. Right? What we're going to look for in a background check is usually typically negative information, arrest records, or whatever else that disqualifies that candidate. Background checks don't generally yield information that we would score as something pushing them closer to the job. It's more a minimum hurdle if you don't. Medical examinations. And interestingly, when I went to work for Boise Cascade, we had to have a medical exam. And this is often important to companies for like hearing tests. If hearing is an important aspect of the job, that might be included in the medical examination. Again, though, it's usually for disqualification purposes. Degrees might then meet or represent a minimal criteria. You will not teach, you will not be hired as a lecturer at Ohio State in the psychology department without a PhD. Simply won't happen. Now, years ago it was possible to teach, as a lecturer with a master's degree, but I don't think so anymore. I think that's going to become increasingly rare, right? Certifications, depending on the nature of your work, right? You might need certifications. That could include like passing the bar exam if we're hiring an attorney. And then references are something that we check up front typically. Considerations. When in the process should screening be conducted? Is the criteria for screening clearly established and communicated? And that is, we are going to tell our applicants we screen on the basis of these criteria. And we usually need to do that so that they can supply us the information we need to screen them as part of it. Is the screening criteria defensible? And that becomes an important aspect. If screening is creating adverse impact, then we might revisit it and say how important it is. Right? If we're saying these people have to have a high school diploma, well, says who? Based on what? What does that predict in terms of on-the-job performance? And if it creates adverse impact, then we better dump it. Right? Okay. Now, next up, and the most typical, the thing when we think about going for a job, what's the thing that we count on is being interviewed, right? And individual interviews, one-on-one, multiple interviews, incumbent interviews. One of the nastiest interviews I had, again, working at Boise Cascade, and this was company-wide. So my initial job as forklift driver, material handler, I was subjected to 2 interviews. But then when I applied for total quality manager position later in my career, etc., when I applied to become the technical rep, etc., they used the same interview system, and it was dastardly, if you will. It was 2 interviews. conducted by two different people. And the first interview was your employment, your work history interview. And they would say, okay, so, and you would sit down across the desk from your interviewer, and they would simply say, okay, for the next hour, I want you to tell me about the jobs you've had, what you've learned, what you did, and just anything you want to talk about career-wise. Next hour, you go. And it's like, oh shit, now I got to talk about myself for an hour in the context of work. And I hated these interviews because it's like, the biggest thing is, let me not say anything wrong. Let me not say anything stupid, right? And now, the next interview, right? So there's two interviews, and they always did this, was the personal interview. And in this case, they say, we want to get to know more. Tell me everything you want to tell me about yourself. What do you do? What are your interests? How do you approach life, etc. This interview could be problematic. I'm not sure it's all that defensible. But you can gain a lot of information, and you can gain a lot of information about questions that you are not allowed to ask. If you want to ask if somebody's religious, that's probably not going to be a legal or defensible question. But if you ask someone to talk about themselves for an hour, what's important to them, and in the course of that hour, if they don't mention their faith or going to church on a regular basis, then what is your assumption? That there's some kind of atheistic heathen, right? I'm playing tongue-in-cheek there. But if you ask me to talk about what I do for an hour, you know, in my personal life, and I never mention going to church, then you can rest assured I'm probably not a religious person. Now, whether that's important or not, but you can see where this is not a nice interview. I wasn't crazy about it. But after the first one, you kind of learn how to negotiate it easily enough, right? Now, so it might be one-on-one, multiple interviews, or incumbent interviews, and often this is where they have incumbents interview you as to the quality of your work, etc. Perhaps a nice system. Sometimes people employ group interviews, and this allows to observe behavior within a group. I'm not fond of this, but we'll talk about interviews. We have a whole section on that. Virtual or phone interviews. When I got my position at Columbus State, it was actually on the basis of a phone interview. They scheduled me for my interview, and I said, oh shit, we're going to be in Hawaii. I know, a tough life, huh? We're going to be in Hawaii during that interview time. And they said, are you okay with a remote interview? That is a conference call. And I said, sure, you know, we can do that. So I actually interviewed for that job with the faculty members at Columbus State while I was in Hawaii. Weird situation too, because we were with a bunch of folks that we knew, a bunch of folks we met in Texas, and these are some drunken partiers, man. There's some crazy people, and it's like I got to go into the dining room where the phone is and have my interview, and I just hope they don't come in and act all a fool while I'm trying to interview. Fortunately, they didn't, so that was cool. Now, behavior, skill-based questions. These are well developed with user rubric and scoring systems. This is where we're going to go more when we get to our interview assignment. Question: would lack of interview be surprising or disappointing to the candidate? Let's suppose we say, I don't even want to bother with interviews. We got all this kind of testing, performance testing. We're not going to do an interview. What do you think? How would a candidate react to that? I don't have an answer. It just makes me curious. Let's talk testing. So, considerations, reliability, and validity. Rest assured, we'll go over those concepts in the appropriate sections. Defensibility, we've talked about this a great deal. We've got to have good record keeping to demonstrate that this is in fact about bona fide occupational qualifications. Cost and time. We've seen a chart on that, but this is something to consider. There are a lot of great ways to test performance, but some of them might just be prohibitive cost-wise or time-wise, right? And then priority of testing. Given cost and time, take those two factors together, we might have to prioritize our tests because we may have only so much budget or so much time overall to conduct these tests of our candidates. Now, examinations, attainments, these are pretty pretty straightforward. There might be legally required certifications, right, for given positions, given jobs, right? If we're hiring doctors or nurses, then they're probably going to have state-level licensing, from advisory boards that do that kind of thing. Degrees. At Columbus State, we entertained the idea. I was on the hiring committee at Columbus State for our psychology lecturers, instructors, and adjuncts. We went around and round about this. We said master's level in psychology was required, a minimum bar. And we were pretty firm on that. We had discussions, should we up it to a PhD? And the interesting thing is, we said, well, let's think about it. Let's keep that on the table. But we interviewed an awful lot of candidates, and we gave a lot of candidates, kind of the performance lectures to do, etc. And we found a lot of candidates that stood out that were at the master's level and not the PhD level. So I don't think PhD was a great criteria there. I don't know that it is at Ohio State either, but it's become kind of a reputational expectation. To what extent do you guys prefer to be taught by doctors, PhD, rather than masters? To what extent do you guys go, oh shit, it's taught by a graduate student instead of a professor, right? So there might be a reputation involved, but that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with on-the-job performance, right? So knew an awful lot of good instructors when I was in the social psych program. Guys like George Beiser, right, who had his master's degree at that point in time. He doesn't have his PhD yet, and he was a fantastic instructor. Christian Wheeler was a fantastic instructor. David Tom, Dr. Tom, was an amazing instructor as a graduate student. So others, not so much, right? So it wasn't the degree attainment necessarily that makes for a good instructor. There's other qualities. Part of that you're probably looking at, right, in a previous assignment. So in your repertory grid assignment. And then licenses as they're necessary, and that might be as simple as a driver's license or a commercial operator's permit or some such. To evaluate the effectiveness of these, well, validity and reliability. Does the assessment method reliably measure a valid aspect of performance? And notice I've shoved both of those statements into a single sentence. Is the measure valid, and does the measure operate consistently? More on that later. Return on investment. Does the measure determine an appropriate cost-benefit relationship? Think about it. We're not going to send candidates for astronaut positions up into space to see how they perform. We got to find some way to test them on the ground, right? We can't incur the expense of testing them by actually sending them up in the air and giving them an on-the-job test in such a manner. That's just not comprehensible, right? Stakeholder reactions. How do management, how do the incumbents, how do applicants and others react to the assessment method, right? And can we make the case that the assessment method is legit and the best possible under our given circumstances? What are you doing, Quincy? I suspect nothing good coming from you right now. This is Quincy, just in case you're wondering. Quincy is a very big boy, aren't you, buddy? Huh? All right. 16 pounds, big boy. I think he's the heaviest in the house. Man, when Quincy came to us, this poor little son of a bitch was a sickly kitten out on the porch. He looked next to death. I was able to scoop him up because he was so ill. Right, because he's a feral kitten. Scooped him up because he was so ill, he could barely move. I took him to the vet, and the vet looked at me like he always does and says, "Where did you find this?" And he, we check him out, give him some medications, some antibiotics, and he says, "I don't know. I mean, we can hope for the best, but I wouldn't get your hopes up." And here he is, this robust maniac. So you never know. How do others react to the assessment method? Now let's talk some other criteria for evaluating the effectiveness, and differentiation is a fascinating idea. Does the assessment method meaningfully differentiate candidates. I mean, if everyone scores 100 points out of 100 on a given assessment measure, then it's worthless because it didn't differentiate. We're trying to rank order people so we can make the best selection possible. If everyone scores 100%, then there's no differentiation, and we might as well have not bothered, right? Now, usability. Will the assessment method be used properly, accurately, and consistently? And of course, who is doing the assessment? Who is interacting with the candidate in this regard? And will it be done the same way? And that's an issue of reliability as well. We want to assess adverse impact. Does the assessment method affect groups differently? And this is why we record demographic information, and we look at each and every we have a group of candidates. We put them through assessment A, and based on assessment A, this given test, then we look at it in terms of demographic information, ethnicity and gender most specifically, and say, wow, are we violating the 80-20 rule here? Is this creating adverse impact? Remember that? So, the assessment plan, job requirements matrix, helps us to prioritize and organize assessment selection and use. I mean, we can develop 20 different assessment instruments, but we might only have time and money to employ 5 of those 20. So how do we determine which assessment instruments we will use? Well, and of course, what is the order? What we do is we develop a job requirements matrix. So we say job duty, like project management, relative importance of the duty, and this could be generated by SMEs or incumbents. Remember, we've already done a lot of this work I'm talking about now. Relative time spent, competency or KSAO that's tested, right? And then the importance of the KSO to the job at hand. Now, this is a judgmental task, but what's this going to say is when we look at all those knowledge, skills, and abilities that we've generated via our person specifications, then we prioritize them. And we try to use some systematic method of prioritizing them, usually consulting incumbents or SMEs, right? And then that allows us to say, wow, this is the most important. Wow, this is the second most important. Wow, this is third most important. And then when we build, right, our assessment plan, we've rank ordered the importance of the different areas, so then we can rank order the assessments corresponding to those areas. Another trick here is not only do we do that, but then we say, what might be the relative contribution to the overall score? So if we're going to give 5 assessments, we're going to use 5 instruments for this candidate, and we say their overall score is 0 to 100. Okay, so assessment A, is that worth 20 points? Or is it more important, should it be worth 30? Is assessment E, the 5th assessment, a little less important than the others, and we're only going to give it a weight of 10 points out of the 100? So we begin to think in terms of prioritizing assessments and the mathematical weighting of those, and we'll have an assignment that explores that as well. I know you can't frickin' wait for that, right? So, the assessment plan continued, then we go on. So, another way to look at this, customer focus, right? Importance of characteristic to job performance, 1 being most important, man. Customer focus in this is super important, right? Are we going to select or train for this? And remember, we have that choice. Should I select on the basis of the candidate possessing this quality, or should I look for potential and then determine that I can train for that quality, right? So, and then where do we get this information? From the resume, from the phone screen? This is an accounting and budgeting test, so we're looking to hire an accountant, right? The recruiter interview, a simulation, a hiring manager interview. These are all, so what we have is the various types that we're going to use, what we're attempting to test, and then determining the priorities in the matrix. Questions about that? It's just about being systematic. It's just about taking it a step at a time. I know it looks big. In fact, it probably looks huge, and a lot of times it probably feels pretty confusing. But if we just take it a step at a time as we've been moving through this course in relatively small modules that are kind of focused in very particular specific areas, it's not tough. Right, Annika? Is this tough? See, she doesn't think it's tough. You guys have a good day.